from the Message translation. I am the real vine, and my Father is the farmer. He cuts off every branch of me that doesn't bear grapes. And every branch that is grape bearing, he prunes back so it will bear even more. You are already pruned back by the message I have spoken. Live in me. Make your home in me just as I do in you. In the same way that a branch can't bear grapes by itself, but only by being joined to the vine. You can't bear fruit unless you are joined with me. I am the vine, you are the branches. When you're joined with me and I with you, the relation intimate and organic, the harvest is sure to be abundant. Separated, you can't produce a thing. Anyone who separates from me is dead wood, gathered up and thrown on the bonfire. But if you make yourselves at home with me and my words are at home in you, you can be sure that whatever you ask will be listened to and acted upon. This is how my Father shows who he is. When you produce grapes, when you mature as my disciples. Off and on, I have been involved in communications for over 40 years, and in all that time I have had an awful lot of bad editors and only a handful of good editors. But for all of my bad experiences of editors, I have never felt that editors were unnecessary. I've never felt that I would be better off without them. Because finding and telling a story is difficult work. You go out somewhere with your tools, your ears, your eyes, your camera, your tape recorder, and you gather as much of the stuff of life as you can, and you come back to your desk or to a dark room somewhere and try to find a way to tell the story that moves in an arc through all that raw material. And sometimes you can't find the story. There's too much material and you're too attached to the stuff to distinguish between what belongs to the story and the good stuff, the beautiful stuff that isn't really the story. You keep adding material, going out and gathering more voices, more images. But if you have no story, you can't help yourself by adding more to it. Your story gets thicker and thicker, but it never actually takes on or conveys any meaning. Perhaps my favorite movie scene of all time occurs near the end of the film Wonder Boys. The movie shows the story of 3 days in the life of Grady Tripp, a novelist and college professor who wrote some critically successful novels early in life and hasn't published anything for years and years. People keep wondering why his new book is taking so long. His students gossip that he has writer's block and that he can't write at all. But the truth is that he can't quit writing. He intended to write a 250-page novel, and he has now written 2,612 pages, and the page count keeps rising. Toward the end of the movie, one of his students, Hannah Green, discovers Grady's 3-box manuscript and tries to read her way through it. She's not able to do so. She falls asleep midway and gives up. And later, Grady discovers that she has seen the manuscript, and he asks her what she thinks of it. And in a moment of courage, she faces him and says, as gently as she's able, Grady, you know how in class you're always telling us that writers make choices? Even though your book is really beautiful, I mean, amazingly beautiful, at times it's very detailed. You know, with the genealogies of everyone's horses and the dental records and so on. And I could be wrong, but it sort of reads in places like you didn't really make any choices at all. In that moment, Grady doesn't take the news well, but he actually knows that she's right. He knows he's never going to have a story until he makes choices. And he understands with painful clarity that absolutely the same thing is true about his life. If the meaning and the purpose of his life elude him now, as they do, it's because he has refused to make choices about what activities and which people are most important to him and which people and pursuits are less important. Every one of us is in the middle of living a story, the story of who we are. And every one of us will have a better story if we recognize that our story, like any other story in the world, will benefit from editing. If we're Quakers, we call that simplicity. If we're Jesus, we call it pruning. I am the real vine and my Father is the farmer. He cuts off every branch of me that doesn't bear grapes. And every branch that is grape bearing, he prunes back so it will bear even more. You are already pruned back by the message I have spoken. I've often read this passage with fear and trembling. It really sounds harsh to speak about being cut back, even being thrown into the fire. And that's why I particularly like Eugene Peterson's way of rendering verse 5. Separated, you can't produce a thing. Anyone who separates from me is dead wood. Because I think that what's going on here is that this is another one of those passages which reads very differently if you read it as descriptive rather than prescriptive. Reading it prescriptively, as though Jesus is telling us this is the way things ought to be, makes the pruning and the dying off sound like punishment. But reading it descriptively, this is just the way the world works, makes it sound like this is just the way the world works. Read descriptively, it sounds more like Jesus is offering to be an editor for our lives than a judge of our lives. Stick close to me, he says, and I will help you find your story. Stay true to your story and your life will have more meaning for you and for everyone around you. Friends tend to call that kind of editing by the name discernment. Discernment is when we employ whatever methods we have of listening for God's guidance to find out what our story is. But here's an interesting thing about these verses. Within a paragraph of the lines about being pruned and productive or falling away and dropping to the ground, Jesus begins his long passages about loving one another. Just 4 verses after living in the vine and becoming productive, John has Jesus saying, "This is my command. Love one another the way I loved you. This is the very best way to love. Put your life on the line for your friends. You are my friends when you do the things I command you. I've named you friends because I've let you in on everything I've heard from the Father. You didn't choose me, remember. I chose you and put you in the world to bear fruit, fruit that won't spoil. As fruit bearers, whatever you ask the Father in relation to me, he gives you. But remember the root command, love one another." I have always struggled to see the connection between being pruned and being told or commanded to love one another. But I wonder whether what Jesus is hinting at is that part of the work of loving one another is willing to be good editors for each other. Maybe the church is supposed to become a place where we learn to be good editors. Maybe by looking at the material of each life, we're supposed to help each other find our stories. and maybe becoming persons with the ability to listen and witness the truth in one another is the main objective of having a church at all. In his book titled Where God Happens, the theologian Rowan Williams writes about the importance of a community of faith for helping us sort out our true stories. It's not because we need someone to tell us what we should do or shouldn't do. We are helped to discover our true stories, our true selves, when we can reveal ourselves to trustworthy persons. And we are helped by the other's ability to accept the revelation of ourselves. Williams writes, think of what the church would be like if it were indeed a community where it was possible to engage each other in this kind of quest for the truth of oneself, without fear, without the expectation of being despised or condemned for not having a standard or acceptable spiritual life. There would need to be some very fearless people around, which is why a church without some quite demanding forms of long-term spiritual discipline is going to be a frustrating place to live. In Williams' thinking, one of the key roles of the spiritual disciplines isn't just to help us discover God's presence. They're also enormously important in allowing us to be really present to each other, allowing us to attend to the reality of what is not me. Because it isn't, after all, our story that we're trying to help our neighbor tell, but her own or his own. Even as members of the same body, God has given none of us either the responsibility nor the right to tell someone else what story they ought to be making with their lives. But God does give each one of us a story to discover, and we can help each other discover that story if we can be, as Williams advises, disinterested in ourselves and attentive to the heart of the neighbor. If we can be, in other words, good editors rather than bad editors. I want to read a portion of Williams' passage again because it always strikes me as so powerful. Think of what the church would be like if it were indeed a community where it was possible to engage each other in this kind of quest for the truth of oneself, without fear, without the expectation of being despised or condemned for not having a standard or acceptable spiritual life. That passage strikes me so deeply because I think it points directly to the ways in which the church has something to offer the world, in which the church has a way to alleviate the pain and lostness of the world, if the church were really the church. What if the passage read this way? Think of what the world would be like if the church were indeed a community where it was possible to engage each other in this kind of quest for the truth of oneself, without fear, without the expectation of being despised or condemned. I have to say, honestly, I find it hard to imagine that happening, at least not in America. Maybe in an isolated church here or there, but not universally across the American church. Because as Americans, we live in a culture that firmly resists the idea of being edited in any way. We are fearsome individualists, and we don't believe anyone else has the authority or the right to interfere in the way we live our lives. Even as consistently 1/2 to 2/3 of Americans report being lonely much of the time, feeling isolated, feeling disconnected, feeling left out, we continue to leave the social settings where connections and purpose are found. And if we're honest about it, we can understand why persons, maybe even ourselves, leave the social arena. in school, at work, in clubs and organizations and politics, there is inevitably conflict. There's bullying. There's a feeling of not being listened to, that one's input isn't valued, of feeling not important enough, or else of carrying all the work on one's own without anybody else contributing. It's a mess. It's chaos. It's time consuming. It's thankless. Unless in some way we already have a good sense of our value, it's difficult to live a peaceful public life, which I think is why so many of us simply leave public life, leave social settings, leave the idea of serving our neighbors, leave the idea of, as Jesus says, laying down your life for your friends. So if the church is going to offer hope to its neighbors, it has to be a different kind of organization, a different kind of club than those we already know about. And the way that it would be different, as William suggests, is by offering genuine friendship, by offering a place where people are loved in truth, but without judgment, a place where people are willing to point out the branches and spurs that don't necessarily belong to your best story, without spurning you if you fail to do some pruning, some editing. Given that this is a countercultural task, that to be this place is to be out of step with the society around us. How could we start? How could we start to be the place, the church with something to offer to neighbors and strangers and people who are not yet us? The only way that I can think of is to start by becoming better friends to those who are our friends. Who do we allow to edit us? Who do we feel editorial towards? Are we ever willing to consider the editorial suggestions of our friends? When we offer editorial suggestions, are they made without self-interest? Does our friendship and love continue even if our edits are not enacted? Are we even open to the idea of building new friendships or deepening old friendships? When I was at Wilmington College, one of the relationships that I really valued, although it wasn't close, was with the sociology professor, Mary Ellen Baddock, who had a deeply Catholic upbringing, but had been associated with Friends for many years, starting with her work in Wilmington's prison program. And she really took the interaction between faith and justice and faith in the world seriously. And in one form or another, I heard her say once that because of all the time that she had spent with friends, she had often wondered what their peculiar gift was within the Christian spectrum. She called it a charism, a special spiritual gift, in the assumption that each church has a kind of special gift that it brings to the spectrum. She said that after a long time, she had thought that the charism of Friends, of the religious society of Friends, is friendship. The Friends' ability to work with and encourage and uphold individuals and groups in becoming who they are. So think about us, the Religious Society of Friends, as trying to become a place that can invite our neighbors, literally our neighbors, the people who live near us, to a setting which will help them discover their stories, discover the meaning and purpose that God has created for them. I think the only way that we can build our capacity to become that place is to build our own individual capacity for friendship, our individual capacity to be involved in the lives of others, to care about what happens to them and for them, to desire always their best good. To do those things is to start becoming the friends that Jesus asks us to be. Creating, redeeming, sustaining God. Show us how to be better friends to one another. To those who are already our friends, to those who are strangers, to our neighbors whom we do not know. Edit us, strengthen us, so that we can better help others find their story, better help others find the place that you have created for them to fill. Help us to release our judgments and to listen to your voice speaking through those around us of what you are calling them to do and be. We ask these things through God who makes them possible. Amen.